Welcome to this episode of Open Scripture, where we seek to sharpen the way the church reads her foundational texts. My name is Tracy McKenzie, professor of Hebrew and Old Testament at Southeastern Seminary, and this is a special episode where we are answering your questions over Genesis 1. Hope you're caught up on our episodes. We, of course, have been through kind of a panoramic view of the Pentateuch and the Lion King. And then we started on Genesis 1. We've had several of those episodes over Genesis 1, and we finished those last week, and now we're answering questions that you all have sent in over Genesis 1. So let's go right to the first question. The first question that we have here is, if God created the universe during those 6 days of creation, which of the 6 days did he create the heavenly angels and Satan? Good question here. And we could say that, he didn't create in the sense, using the word create. If we want to kind of keep our eyes on the differences between the word create and maybe the word make or a few other words in Genesis 1, he, of course, created the universe in Genesis 1:1. You remember we asserted that, Genesis 1:2 says, and the earth was, and the waters were. So those are already created before the days actually begin. But in general, this question could also be saying, hey, when did he create Satan and angels? And again, this question does show us something about this writing. We often perhaps don't think of historians as selecting topics or texts or stories that they're actually going to use in their work. But of course, all historians have to select. And the biblical author here is no different. He is selecting different things to focus on. And he, of course, is not focusing on the creation of the angels or of demons or Satan really at all. He does presume them, of course, when we get to chapter 3. But here in chapter 1, you can see that his intentionality is not to cover those aspects of God's creation. So he's being very selective here. He doesn't tell us a lot of things. So this is where I would say we have to pay attention to what he does tell us. And questions like this are great questions and that we can ponder, but we have to recognize too that the author doesn't give us that information. So in a sense, we can try to answer it, but we will be outside of the intentionality that we see here in these texts when we try to answer it. Here's another question. It's still hard to wrap my head around how we have light pre-sun. Is it concerning Isaiah 60:19 or Revelation? Does that help us? God has no need of the sun as he is light. And if we then get the sun and the moon in verses 14 through 19, what happened to the light we had prior to this? Where did it go and why? Well, this also is related to the question about the creation of the universe in 6 days and Satan's and demons. Because again, remember, we asserted that the sun, the moon, and the stars were already created, again, in the universe, in the heavens and the earth, in Genesis 1:1. And again, the thing that demonstrates that is day one, God moves this light into place. So with the to be verb, let there be light in day one, God doesn't create the light in day one. He just moves it, brings it into this particular locale, and it sheds light over the darkness. Of course, we would also say the other proof for this is there was evening and morning on days 1, 2, and 3 before day 4, when the sun, the moon, and the stars came into their place. Moreover, we have grass and plants being brought forth on day 3. So it would be hard to have grass and plants without the sun. It would also be hard to have morning and evening without the sun. And finally, on day 4, we asserted that the sun and the moon and the stars weren't created. Instead, they were brought into their place. And again, using the grammar of made to give light. In other words, they weren't made on day 4. They were made to give light. So their purpose was to give light over the day and the night and rule over the day and the night. So it's a purpose statement. Day 4 is a purpose statement of what the sun, the moon, and the stars were doing as they were also filling those spheres that God had made in days 1 through 3. Keep in mind kind of this literary framework that days 1, 2, and 3, God divides and separates and makes these spheres, if you will, and then he fills those on days 4, 5, and 6. Another question, again, relates to some of these same ideas that we've been talking about, so we'll try to be crisp here in our explanation. But does the debate between young Earth and old Earth have any value at all in your opinion? Or does viewing Genesis 1:1 as a statement about all creation render the debate completely pointless? So again, this viewer grasped the idea that, again, in Genesis 1:1, God had created the heavens and the earth, again, giving this sort of totality, heavens and the earth being this merism, where God had, in a sense, created all of the things that he needs to then fashion the heavens and the earth the rest of the week, which is what he's doing in those 6 days after Genesis 1:1. So again, Genesis 1:1 is before the days begin. So you could have extended period of time in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. 1:2, that is verse 2, assumes the existence already of the earth and the waters and the great deep. So there could be this great period of time in those days now, or in that time before the days. Now, we would still assert, or at least I would still assert, that the presentation that the author is giving here is that these days are portrayed as 24-hour days. So once that initial period is ended, then these days, at least according to the author, if we take morning and evening seriously, are 24 hours. Could they be longer? Yes, they could be. But again, that's not the simplest explanation of morning and evening. So at that point, then, we would move through this week fairly quickly. But again, if we consider the point of the author, remember, what we're doing in this particular reading, if you will, is we are working very hard to discern the intentionality of the author. Can we also draw implications or inferences or have other questions related to the universe and the existence of sin and the existence of evil, the existence of demons? Yes, we can ask all of those, but we just have to know that they're outside of what these biblical texts really assert. And really, I would say it's the same thing for young earth and old earth. One thing I kind of want to assert, though, is young earth, those who believe in a young earth, which, again, I have friends that believe in this, so it's not a problem, but they often say that their view is biblical, and old earth, those who believe in old earth, are caving into science or doing kind of a figural reading or spiritual reading versus a literal reading. And I just have to say that that's not the case. Again, remember, we're trying to understand why chapter 1, verse 2 already has the earth existing. So if the earth already exists in verse 2 before the days begin in verse 3, then we have to consider the passage of time in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Finally, don't forget also that in Genesis 1, verses 3 through 5, it's not the first day, it's one day. This in the following days, it is called the second day, the third day. We have these ordinal numbers, whereas the first day, that is day 1, is not the first day, it's just day 1. Again, giving the possibility or plausibility that time was taking place before day 1. So I would say that the young earth, old earth debate is, again, outside the framework of intentionality of the author in Genesis 1. And in that sense, it is a little bit pointless as it relates to the Bible. Another good question here is that since some animals already existed after Genesis 1:1, does this allow for animal death before sin entered into the world? And does that in any way compromise God creating he has, quote, perfect, unquote, world? So again, just to begin this question, we have to answer the question, is it a perfect world? It is a good world. But does that mean perfect? And perhaps we should just go with what the biblical author does and say it's a very good world, although we're going to see it's less than God, so it's not perfect, we could say. But his larger question here is, since these animals already existed after Genesis 1:1. So again, this listener has understood that it is possible or plausible, or at least potential, that these animals from day 5 already existed prior to this, because God makes them. He doesn't create them. And on the one hand, we're kind of holding in balance here. We want to see a bit of a distinction between the word create that we see in 1:1, we see on the 5th day, and then we see here in the creation of man and woman, between this word bara and the word make, which the author has used here several times to talk about God fashioning things or forming them, but not in the same way that he does create. And so we want to hold a little bit of distinction, but not an entire distinction between these two, because of his use of these two words. And really the point of his create, his use of that word, is day 6. And the threefold use of that for his act of creation, man and woman. Now, just a quick word here about his use of the word make and create. We can see on day 6 where he expresses his volition. This is the second act on day 6. He expresses his volition, let us make mankind, uses the word make here, right? And then he goes and says, the author uses, and God created. So God is completely involved here in his volition, in his use of the word make, and then in his action of creating. As we move backward to the previous act on day 6, we might notice here in verse 24, where day 6 first begins, that God expresses his volition, let the earth bring forth. So here his volition is that the earth is going to bring forth the cattle and the creeping thing, these living beings in verse 24, of course, after their kind. And then notice that the act of actual making that takes place is, and God made the living things after their kind, that is the cattle and the creeping things. So again, God's involvement here, but it's the earth, at least, that he expresses volition that's going to bring forth. So as we move back in the days, God's action of actually doing, or his volition, is less and less involved. We could move back to day 4 here. We could move back to day 5 first, where he says, let the waters swarm with these swarming things. So here it's the waters that he's expressing his volition that would literally bring forth, right? It's let the waters swarm. These swarming things would be the literal rendering of it. And then, of course, God creates. So he's totally involved here. And in a sense, he's creating the great sea monsters. This is a very express act of creation. But I don't know that the point here is so much that these great sea monsters are somehow unique. All of these things that God created here on day 5 are unique. They get blessed to be fruitful and multiply. But the point here is not so much, I don't think, their uniqueness, as it is this crescendo of God's actions in Genesis 1. If we just moved back one more to day 4, we know what's going to happen on day 4. God says here on day 4, let there be lights to give light. Now, you remember here in our argument here of day 4, he wasn't saying, let the lights be, or I'm going to create the lights. No, he was saying, let the lights be to give light. And so then God makes them to give light. And that was their purpose here, to give light, not his act of creating them. Again, as we've already answered the other questions, there's evidence that suggests that the sun, the moon, and the stars were created on day 1. If we kept going back in each day, we would see God's his involvement is less and less on these previous days. So if we go all the way back to verse 1, it's very simple. Let light be, and light was. So his expressive volition here, let light be, and then no account of how it actually comes to pass, just that it has come to pass. Now, this question also gets at the idea of death before the fall. And we could answer this several ways. First of all, if you remember, the universe shows signs of age because of the creation that took place in Genesis 1:1, and the fact that verse 2 says the earth was already. In other words, it already existed prior to day 1 beginning in verse 3. The waters were already existing. So there's this passage of time before we get to day 1. You might recall also that this is day 1. This is not the first day, because he doesn't use the ordinal number like he does on the other days. It is the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, but here it's just day 1, again, allowing for the passage of time before we get to day 1. So we could say the heavens and the earth are possibly or plausibly very old, but once we hit the days, the portrayal here in Genesis 1 is that these are presumably 24-hour days. Do they have to be? Does it say 24 hours? No, but again, the simplest reading of morning and evening is 24 hours. And the simplest rendering of the verse of the word day is 24 hours. Can day mean a longer period of time? Yes. But here in Genesis 1, it doesn't seem like it means that. So we could say that man and woman on day 6, and even the animals on day 6, are a relatively later, act of creation. And because they're later, they could still be young. And then again, the fall comes along right after that, and the death would come along with the fall. Now, finally, we could just say very quickly that Paul's, this question also, I'm sure, has part of the background of the question is Paul's statement in Romans 5 that death came in through sin. He's talking about Adam as the man, the first man, the type of man. And he's also talking about Jesus being man, a type of the man who was earlier, whose sin, death entered into the world. So Paul obviously has in mind here the death of man. He's not necessarily talking about animal death in his statement here in Romans 5. So we could, again, if we want to extend animals back into that period prior to the days, we could assert that, okay, that doesn't really negate Paul's argument here in Romans 5 of his reading of Genesis 1. Finally, we could also say that even though we don't have human rebellion until Genesis 3, we do have apparently demonic rebellion or angelic rebellion prior to Genesis 3, because of course you have the serpent who comes onto the scene, who has rebelled against God, who does question God's authority. So we have demonic rebellion prior to the fall, if you will, and that demonic rebellion could have very easily affected animal life. Our next question, can we see the switch in number on the pronominal suffix that's on the word for image and use it as a defense for the doctrine of the Trinity? That is our image, his image, his image. This would be, I think, in verse 26 and verse 27. I'll just read those. And God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over the cattle and over all the land, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the land or the earth. And God created man in his image. In the image God had created him, male and female, he created them. So he's asking, this person is asking about the pronominal suffix here. You have a his, right, in his image, but you also have, of course, according to our image. And I think this is coherent with the Trinitarian perspective of Genesis 1. I wouldn't say we could really use it explicating or exegeting that. I do think, and we asserted this, I think, earlier in our episodes, that you have God in Genesis 1:1, you have the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2, and later on in his book, the author is going to frame this in the beginning. He's going to show that the Lion King created, right, this reshit, this beginning, if you will. So we have the Son of God, if you will, that is the Son of Judah, the son of Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, the son of Seth, eventually the son of Adam, the son of God, who is involved in this. So we can assert here, I think, a Trinitarian perspective, but I'm not sure if the pronoun here on the image really helps us in that. One thing I might want to add here is that, again, remember that the author is standing at the end of the book. The author is not writing this, if you will, let's say from the perspective of when creation happened. In other words, the author is not there at creation. The author is not there when Adam and Eve were created or when the animals were made. The author's not there when Adam and Eve fell, right? The author, if we presume Moses, of course, he's way later in the year approximately 1400 BC. And this is if we have Moses as the author. If someone later is the author, again, we have him much later. So the author is making this book, pulling these stories together, selecting and arranging them for a particular point. And so he knows already that Israel has struggled with obedience. He knows, of course, the story of Abraham. He knows the story of the flood story and Noah's even fall in the garden. He knows Seth and Adam. He knows Enoch. He knows Cain and Abel. And he's fashioning this book, again, in line with his intentionality. Now, that statement about where the author is in perspective of the whole book brings us to another question. Given your understanding of Old Testament Hebrew, I'd love to hear your perspective on how the land connects to your eschatology. Great question, and one that we eventually will get to as we move throughout this text. We just, having just read Genesis 1, we really haven't had enough information to really show, if you will, or present our view of eschatology. However, we could also say that since we've done a panoramic of the Pentateuch, we know that the author is very interested in the eschaton, right? The word the last days that we demonstrated and talked about throughout the Lion King series, those 4 episodes. That translates into eschatus hemerus, the last days, which is where our word eschatology comes from. Now, in general, when you talk about eschatology in systematic theology, they're talking about Christ's second coming. And the Pentateuch doesn't separate Christ's first coming from his second coming. But we know that the Pentateuch is very interested in the king's first coming, which we would, of course, say Jesus is the king, and he arrived on the scene, of course, and he showed himself as king when he defeated death. So we would very much say that, yes, the king has come, the last days have begun, and we would even say that there is a connection to the land here. And again, because the author is standing at the end of the book, the author is obviously interested in Israel. He's obviously interested in a land promise. Now, we have to ask, what is that land? And we will talk about that when we come to Genesis 2, when we come to Genesis 3, and again, when we get into the Abrahamic narratives later on. It's going to be a very often addressed question. But we would just simply say, notice here that even though the author is primarily has in view Israel because of where he's standing, that is the author at the end of this book, we could say, again, if it's Moses, they're just getting ready to enter the land, right? But notice he already knows that the land, that is the literal dirt, we could say, of Israel. We could say the dirt or the piece of land that's represented by the modern nation-state Israel. That land is not going to be enough to create the sort of utopian or create the place where God's people will dwell. And it is interesting here that in Genesis 1 through 11, the author shows his interest in a much greater land than that piece of dirt that Israel occupies. No, he's interested in the heavens and the earth. And isn't it interesting that Isaiah, we could go to many authors, and we will given time, but Isaiah, of course, when he talks about God's return and his rule, he talks about his rule over the new heavens and the new earth. We could also simply say, just to bring in a little bit of a New Testament perspective here, that when Jesus is talking with the woman at the well, and she, of course, comes back and says, hey, my fathers worship God here, your fathers worship God there. Jesus says, no, there is a time coming when true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. So again, just to lay the cards on the table, I don't think the point of these texts in the Old Testament are really talking about the dirt that we would say, the physical place of Israel. It's a much larger place than that. It is the heavens and the earth. Well, our next question has a reader saying, I'm wondering what you think about the mention of, quote, the breath of life in verse 30. Do you think animals have the breath of life means that animals are spiritual? Well, this question will also lead into our last question regarding translation, because this is a kind of interesting view here. In verse 30, I'll just read this, says, and to every beast of the earth, to every living thing of the earth, to every bird of the heavens, to every creeping thing upon the earth. So all of the things that basically God has made or created here in these days, he says, which is in it, and then apparently one of the English versions says the breath of life. But the idea here, which is in it, a living thing. We actually saw this exact phrase in the verses up above where he creates or makes all of these creatures. So, for example, we see it in days 5 and 6. We see it in verse 20. God said, let the waters swarm, a swarming living thing. That phrase there, living thing or living being, is the exact phrase. It's not just a word, it's a phrase that we see down here in verse 30. Moreover, this is also in day 6. Let the earth bring forth a living thing, right? This is the same word. So I think breath of life here is probably a translation, again, where they didn't know perhaps, or they didn't want to repeat the idea of a living thing. So we can just point out again that this exact phrase that's translated breath of life in verse 30 is in verse 20 after the swarming things. It's in verse 21. God created the great sea monsters and every living thing creeping, which the waters swarmed after their kind. It is in verse 24. God said, let the earth bring forth a living being. A shortened version of it is in verse 28. And then again, we see it in verse 30. So I would simply say that verse 30 is reiterating not so much the breath of life, which is what we're going to see God breathe into man in chapter 2. Rather, this is just a reiteration of the living thing. Now, that brings us to our last question here. And our last question is, how reliable are our English translations, given some of your explanation of things? And again, this is one of the reasons why I've said that we need to get as many English translations involved as possible. It's not so much that our English translations are unreliable in any way, shape, or form. They are so reliable, and we're so blessed to have so many of them. So it's not really about reliability or unreliability. The point is that every translation is an interpretation. And this is because there is no one-to-one correspondence between languages. And we can just take, for example, again, the arguments here from language are so complex. Languages are so complex. Words are so complex. These are complex issues which are adequate to give meaning and to convey meaning and to convey intentionality, but they're not absolute. They're not these vessels that are contained absolutely the entire meaning of the word. No, there's nuance to each of these words. There's fuzzy edges around each of these words. And again, for example, just English style, right? English style doesn't like repetition. We are taught from an early age, don't repeat words, use a different word, use a synonym. So again, in this example in verse 30, where they use the breath of life rather than living thing, perhaps this particular version didn't want to repeat the living thing that had already taken place 4 or so times up above. And so because of English style, they switched it to breath of life. That's just one example of how English, in some ways, is at cross purposes with the Hebrew, which loves repetition and uses repetition. These authors use repetition and association of these words to make meaning. And so English, in a sense, is like this veil, or it's like this blanket, if you will, where you can't get to the exact nuance of the Hebrew. It's a fine translation. It's reliable in a sense, but in a sense, it also masks the finer details and even some of the complexities. Sometimes it's when you see complexities in language that reveal the author's intention. And again, that is where some of these English versions make these decisions for the interpreter instead of leaving them with questions. Well, if this episode has been helpful, just ask that you share it or like it, you pass it along. Again, the algorithms on these where you listen to your episodes are sometimes brutal. So I'd ask you to like and share and extend the reach of this material. So I hope this helps show that why the Bible is for you and about you, and I hope you join us next time as we begin our series in Genesis 2.